Mr. T.S.R. Subramaniam is with us on the program tonight. Also Sanjay Pinto, lawyer and columnist, joining us tonight from Chennai. Mr. Subramaniam, you in fact just heard the comments that Mr. UMASHANKAR was making, and he says that under Article 25 it is his fundamental right. He insists that he's not undertaking any conversions and so on, and therefore he will continue to fight for that right. How do you look at that, sir? Because many would say, as a serving officer, this is highly inappropriate conduct as well.
Apart from any subjective judgment about this conduct is appropriate or not, I think the general issue is that the fundamental rights are available to all citizens. They supersede every other privilege or right, and they cannot be taken away, but unilaterally. But this is now a contractual arrangement between employee and employer. Nobody demands that UMASHANKAR should continue to be an IAS officer. It is his choice to stay or not. So, for example, a person joins the army, he is bound with the army rules, which are much, much more stringent than civilian rules. The code of conduct, the rules of behavior in the army are far stringent there, and they forgive and they forgo a lot of the rights there. So, on the broad question, the reasonable restriction can come into when two people's fundamental rights clash. There can be reasonable restriction. The other kind of reasonable restriction is when you voluntarily give up in the course of your work or in the course of your vocation. For example, a judge cannot behave like another person, be found drunk in a bar, for example.
I'm
giving an extreme example. And these standards, the second question was, what is the legal basis for these standards? I think, if I am not mistaken, the All India Service Conduct Rules is part of the Services Act and therefore part of the delegated legislation. It has stood the test of the last 60 years. I can't vouchsafe right now that it is, if it is delegated legislation, it has the force of law. And that law can be tested, of course, in the Supreme Court, and if it is found to be incorrect, it can be taken away. But nobody questions.
Right. Sanjay Pinto, you have a different take on that. Sanjay, I'm sure you understand what Mr. Subramaniam is trying to say, that, as a serving officer, there are certain standards that you're, held to, which are different, from other people. How do you see this debate, Sanjay?
Nidhi, the Constitution of India does not envisage two categories of citizens, normal citizens and officers, who in this case seem to be lesser mortals. The Constitution is equal for all categories of citizens. Now, fundamental rights are granted, and in fact not just granted but guaranteed. Officers today are not children, and fundamental rights are not some sweets that you will stash away in a cupboard and give it to them when they grow up, or in this case when they retire. Fundamental rights are inalienable. They do not give up their fundamental rights. I get Mr. Subramaniam's point of view. I respect his view. However, there are reasonable restrictions. When are these fundamental rights affected? When there is emergency, the fundamental rights are suspended. There are reasonable restrictions. In this case, the reasonable restriction being public order. What Mr. Subramaniam is talking about, for instance, I've seen some of his comments in the past as well, where he talks about writing for newspapers, for instance, where an officer has to get permission. Fair enough. But that's not a ban. That's not a blanket ban. That is a case of not even a restriction but regulation. With permission, they can do that. In this case, preaching, what's wrong with preaching? Preaching, he's not doing black magic. He's not holding people in captivity. He's preaching in a church, for God's sake. I almost said Christ's sake. For God's sake, he's preaching in a church. People, believers come in. Where's the question of conversion?